So when we're talking about potentiality, we're saying that potentiality is incomplete. And the question is, why is it incomplete? The justification for its incompleteness is that it is in a state of becoming, right? So that's the technical response. I'll say that again. In a discussion of potentiality and actuality, we realize that potentiality is incomplete. And the question that one can ask is to why is potentiality incomplete? Because it is in the process of becoming. In describing actuality, we recognize that actuality is complete. And we ask ourselves the question, why is actuality complete? Why is this thing completed? And the reason, the justification is that it's completed because it is, right? It is. We say it's completed because it is. When we say it is, we're referencing its being, right? Its existence, right? So this completeness of our potential is the culmination in the sort of transformation of this thing's form, right? The form of this thing has changed. Me walking to the chapel with my significant other to get married is substantially different from me finally being married, right? Me having a chair which I can sit on and then dismantling that chair for it to become a table is substantially different from, and I don't mean substantially in the substance form for you philosopher nerds that are watching, I just mean that in the colloquial sense. It's entirely different, right? It's entirely different from me transforming that thing into what it now is, right? It now is a table. It used to be a chair. Okay, well let's now turn to Aristotle's discussion of the acorn and the oak tree. In the discussion of the acorn and the oak tree, what we need to do is bracket, right, the discussion. We're not going to talk about what comes after the oak tree. We're not going to talk about what comes before the acorn, because we know what it is. An oak tree came before the acorn, and an acorn comes after the oak tree. So let's just bracket that. And the reason why we're bracketing that is so that we can do an analysis to prevent an infinite regress, right? We don't want to have an infinite regress, so we bracket the part of redundancy where redundancy would arise. It's just a transition between these. And now let's do an analysis of acorns and oak trees. Well, if we think about it and we ask ourselves, with respect to potentiality and actuality, where would potentiality go? Would we say that the acorn has potentiality, or would we say that the oak tree has potentiality? With respect to the idea of actuality, the question is, would we say that the acorn has actuality, or would we say that the oak tree has actuality? Well, let's look at it now, and let's make some sense of what Aristotle says between the distinction between acorns and oak trees. Well, if we say that the idea is this of becoming, right? If we say that the idea is this notion of becoming, well, we recognize essentially that an acorn is in the process of becoming an oak tree, right? An acorn is in the process of becoming an oak tree, right? So that becoming, okay, so that becoming goes here. Well, we recognize that if becoming goes here, then the acorn actually, or rather, wrong word, the acorn is the sort of embodiment of this potentiality, right? The acorn is the embodiment of this potentiality. The acorn has the potential to transform its form, to transform its function from a thing which turns into oak trees to a thing which, well, I'll wait for that part, right? I don't want to give it away just yet. So we recognize that the form can be transformed and that it is necessarily potential, right? So we say that the acorn is a representation of potentiality. Okay, so the acorn is in the process of becoming, the acorn is a representation of potentiality, and then obviously, most importantly, the acorn is then necessarily incomplete. Right? The acorn is then necessarily incomplete. So these are the three characteristics we can use to describe, let me erase that, to describe the acorn. The acorn is in the process of transforming itself, of becoming. The acorn is representational of the potential that it has to transform into this new form. And the acorn then is inherently incomplete. It hasn't completed the potentiality inherent within. Okay, now let's switch and look at the oak tree. All right? Alright. Well, obviously then, we see that the oak tree is, right? The oak tree is, it is what? Well, it's a representation of the being, the existence that this potential has, right? Once this has been transformed, and you can think that within the acorn is the potential, obviously, for an oak tree, right? So that potential is in there. Once this being has been revealed, once it is transformed, once it has exposed itself, we say that that potential has been actualized, right? So that the oak tree is a representation of actuality, right? What is being actualized? And that's the question. What has been actualized in the oak tree? What has been actualized in the oak tree is the potential for what we would call maybe oak tree-ness of the acorn. Okay? And then obviously then, we recognize that according to Aristotle, since the oak tree is indicative of actuality, of the actualization of the acorn's potential, well, we recognize that it is representative also of completeness. Right? It is representative of completeness, right? It has completed the potential of the acorn, right? The potential of the acorn has been completed in the existence of the oak tree, right? And I'll say that again. The potential of the acorn has been completed, has been fulfilled, has been actualized in the existence of the oak tree, right? So that we recognize then, if we were to talk about which came first with respect to acorns and oak trees, well, it wouldn't be logical to say, argues Aristotle, that potentiality began everything, right? If we're attempting to prevent an infinite regress, right? You want to prevent an infinite regress by having a foundational starting point, or a foundational claim, or a foundational assertion. In the attempt to prevent this infinite regress, we need something to begin this whole chain of being, this whole chain of existence. The point is, according to Aristotle, this chain of existence cannot begin with that which is incomplete. And the question is why? Why can't we begin with that which is incomplete? Well, you'll recognize that the existence of an oak tree is defined, right? The existence of an oak tree, a thing is, which is important, a thing is an oak tree if that tree produces acorns, right? To be an oak tree means that the tree produces acorns, right? That's a function of being an oak tree rather than an evergreen, right? The existence, the isness, the way in which we recognize or classify taxonomically an oak tree from, let's say, an evergreen, is that an oak tree produces acorns, right? So that to be an oak tree means that the thing produces acorns. So what we recognize in this is that this existence embodies both this existence and something different. So just for the sake of a good visual, imagine that we classify this thing as W, right? So that the acorn and everything that it represents is a classification of W. Well, the oak tree would be something like this, right? And I just picked W at random, right? The oak tree would be a classification of, let's say, W and X. In talking about this one thing, all of this existence is already discussed, is already described, is already assumed in the existence of this one thing. But I also have something else which is not at all articulated or described or covered in this existence. Therefore, this existence is has more potential, not more potential, has more explanatory power, has more actuality, has more actuality than this, right? Because let's say the only things that I can talk about in this are all things W. In this, I can talk about all things W plus some new thing. This, I can talk about potentiality, right? The actuality of this existence means that for it to be, for it to exist, it is both a representation of the actualization of that potential, but it also creates new potential, right? It also creates new potential. The creating new potential isn't contingent. It's a necessary fact, right? The existence of this oak tree is necessitated by the fact that it creates this new potential. It creates more acorns.